Hi everybody, it's Lisa Murrell from Equine Alchemy, and today we are going to talk about the energy work that Linda Kohanov came up with. And so there's a specific sequence to introducing this work because there's been so many inroads into the field, and sometimes it can be overwhelming. So I actually, in your EFL playbook on page 46, have made a little cheat sheet, Introduction to the Energy Work. And so it begins with Merlin's story. Let me read you the steps and then I'll go through each one. After that, then we're going to have Shannon and Robert, graduates from Equine Alchemy, to show you the demonstrations with humans and horses. So get ready, because here we go. All right, we talk about Merlin's story because we want to be able to demonstrate how experiences with horses actually have involved energy work, even though we may not have called it that. So you are perfectly able to use your own stories, but Merlin's story is already here. So it really doesn't matter, you can use your own. So I'm going to use Merlin's story right now, which is told in great detail in Writing Between the Worlds, one of Linda's books. And so here we go. Merlin was a stallion who was highly abused and mistreated because he was an immature dominant. Any of you who have read Power of the Herd or The 5 Roles of the Master Herder, also from Linda, will recognize that term. Basically, he was very challenging to handle, much less ride, and so as a result of his mishandling, his inability to be handled, he was in a very compromised position when Linda found him. And so she decided to bring him home as what she calls it, as a project. She really wanted to get to know him, try to bring him to a place where he could be around people safely and people could be around him safely. So as she was doing this, what she did was what she normally does when she does this work, is she would look for thresholds, going as close to him as she possibly could without him becoming aggressive, because she wanted to stay safe, obviously. And then she would back off. So she'd build these thresholds each time she went out. And maybe she would get a little closer, maybe she'd get a little closer. But then at one point, she couldn't get any closer. And no matter what she did, she seemed to always end up at the same spot. And so as she was trying to figure this out, because it was a work in progress, she realized something just happened to help her to realize this thing about energy. She either had a something on her shoulder, or she brushed against her shoulder, and what she recognized is that Merlin moved as though she touched him. And so she did it again, and Merlin responded as though he had been touched physically. And so she said, well, let's go a little further with this. And so she had studied with Linda Tellington Jones, who does kind of like an acupressure modality with horses, and she calls them T-touches. So she did these T-touches, different places on the body, in the air, at that same threshold that she had been unable to go beyond for quite some time. And at each one of these places, he would respond as though he was being touched physically. And so what she realized is that he actually was being touched physically to him. He was a high sensitive. And I remember her describing this to me. She said, oh, please don't let this be about energy, because she was concerned her work was too woo-woo already. And this was before the art mouth came out, all that research, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And so basically, I want to show you this diagram. What she found is there's 3 main energy layers, right? There's the one on the outside, and that is what she called the environmental layer. And that was the layer that when she came into the field to work with him, on the very outside, he knew that she was aware of him, right? And so then as she walked closer, remember I told you she worked with thresholds? She came in here to the middle one, and this was the connection layer. And that was the layer that she was doing the Linda Tellington Jones T-touches at, and that's where she knew that, okay, we are connected with each other at this point. But she could get no further than here. This is the personal layer. She also did the touches there as well. this is where he felt that this is the same as touching me physically. So these three energy layers let her know that at some point his existence was out and beyond his body. And so she called these energy fields or layers. And there's multiple ones in between here, but these were the main three. So as she became more aware of this, she began to desensitize him through just gradual pushes beyond that threshold of his personal layer. And so she finally got to a point through acknowledgement and respect of his being, of his space, of his energy. She got to a point where she could actually physically touch him. And of course, when I went through the apprenticeship back in 2006, I actually did this work with him. He was able to work with people. He was, one had to certainly be aware, which this is all, as Barbara Rector calls this work, Adventures in Awareness. She's the grandmother of this work. Working with Merlin, you did have to have a large awareness of what was going on around you. And that was one of the biggest lessons that I had, because I didn't have very much awareness when I started this. So I was all proud and happy in myself when I could get to his connection layer. And then I turned around to everyone and said, look, I did it, you know, smiling, thinking I'm so all that. And then all of a sudden I hear Linda say, watch out, he's coming right behind you. So see, the minute I stopped being aware, it was as though there was nothing in between me and him, and he came towards me. I mean, he wasn't running at me or anything like that, but he was definitely requiring me to be fully present if I was going to be there. We were in an arena-sized space. So it was very interesting to learn about this boundary work with Merlin, which is the way that Linda came up with this boundary work. So that's the first thing you need to talk about. Now I'm going to go back to the teaching method, the meta method, for you all who are going to be facilitators. So you begin with this, right? Some kind of story so that people can actually understand what you're talking about. Because if you talk about energy fields and electromagnetic things and all of this, it can be quite daunting, if not just sounding woo-woo or confusing. So start with something that people can relate to, and this is Merlin's story. Well, what happened after she'd done this, obviously she wrote the Tao of Equine, and then she wrote Writing Between the Worlds. Well, this work caught on like wildfire, and this was back in 1999 or 2000. And she knew that she had to, well, an organization was formed around her work, and she realized that working with people was not as easy as working with Merlin, as difficult as that was. So she had to apply these concepts to humans as well. That there were people who were unaware of each other's space, they were stepping into each other's awareness, people were just not paying attention. And so she said, well, I got to figure out how to apply these same concepts. And she recognized, with the help of Kathleen Berry Ingram, who is a psychotherapist, that people also, we humans, have these layers of awareness, these energy fields, these layers. So instead of having the horse in the middle of the circle, it could be us. And that if we were paying attention to these, it would help us to be in relationship and community more easily with others. So what I'm saying here is that although we have the same ability to an awareness of spatial proximity, I'll call it, as horses, we are so top heavy that we've forgotten about it. That reptilian part of our brain, which interacts with our environment before we cognitively process it, is still here. So this was something that she could begin to apply her horses with concepts, her concepts of horses to humans. And again, this is one of the biggest reasons why horse wisdom is so powerful. So if you look at on page 46, and we're talking about Merlin's story, there's bullet points underneath there. So the most important aspect is to introduce the client to the 3 layers of connection, which I've done, and I use my little diagram, right? Then you can use props. Sometimes I used to use a baggie, and I could push into it, or a balloon, because it is like that. Horses respond to pressure, right? But an aid is not an aid until you stop using it. So you apply the pressure, and you want to have as little pressure as possible to get their attention. Well, it's the same thing as tapping someone on the shoulder. You can tap them on the shoulder, or you can really push them, but that is a way of getting their attention. So you can use props to demonstrate this, as well as draw rings in the sand or use a diagram like I just used. And then this is where we can get kind of tricky. You can use the language of layers of energy, or you can use the word boundary. So this is where I like to switch from layers of energy to boundary, because boundaries are, I think people are more aware of their issues with boundaries than they are with layers of energy. Hold on. Also, if you use both of them interchangeably, it kind of confuses people. So I would recommend that you clarify that, the difference between the two, and choose one. And I recommend boundaries. So the next bullet is looking at how the scientific research supports this, right? Linda was afraid it was energetic, it was too woo-woo. A lot of people at the beginning of this field, back in the early 2000s, really did not find it viable because of its lack of scientific collaboration. And so meanwhile, the Institute at HeartMath, heartmath.org, does and has done some really terrific research around exactly what we're talking about, around these layers, but instead of the horse, the heart is in the middle. And so then you get to talk about HeartMath. And this is the diagram that I use. And it is in your playbook, and it's on page 69. And it talks about that the heart's electromagnetic field is 5,000 times greater than that of our brains. And this just validates that we are interacting with our environment, with our heart, that's our second brain, and our gut, which is our third brain, or our enteric nervous system. And then it goes up into the new brain, which is the neocortex, and that is where we start processing things in the frontal lobe. That's where language is. So if we have these feelings, they have to go all the way up here, and then, okay, language turns it into a word. Carla McLaren, who wrote The Language of Emotions, talks about the feelings and sensations we have in our body are that, and that they don't become emotions until we process them in the brain, and they become, we have a label for them. So that is actually what's happening. So you can point to this scientific research. The HeartMathInstitute.org or heartmath.org has some really great stuff on their website. You can take pictures, you can take materials, but it's a wonderful way to explain to people who aren't particularly not into the mystical. They would like to have more concrete information, but also some people are too into the mystical and they think it's more magical, and so it's very important to have them grounded in real information. So I recommend that you check out that work at heartmath.org. Also, there is in your playbook an article called The Heart as an Organ of Perception, and it's a really terrific article on everything I've been talking about. So it's just yet another tool that you can use to help people to understand this concept. Because this concept, remember, this is one of the basic concepts of all of the equine facilitated learning. This and the body scan and the messages behind emotions. So looking at the body and the heart as an organ of perception, as a center for perception, as the 3 brains, all of this is what's actually happening as we are doing the horse work. But we're not going to tell everybody everything all at once. So that's why I've outlined this with bullet points, right? Okay, so if we go back to the introduction to the energy work, we've done the 4 bullets under Merlin's story. Then we go to number 2. Introduce the concept of our human trait of automatic response to spatial proximity and how it is now unconscious as a result of not really listening or trusting our feelings. And this is the place where we look at conditioned behavior. At this point, you have probably talked about the authentic versus the conditioned self, but if you haven't, for whatever reason, you can bring that into this conversation. So basically, as I said, we all kind of started out, we all have this part of the brain. We all have an awareness of spatial proximity, however developed, undeveloped, nurtured, or unnurtured. And so what happens to it? Not everybody, sometimes it's conditioned out of us through trauma, some as a result of just culturalization, acceptance, not acceptance. But let's think back. When you were, I don't know, 3 or 4, something like that, do you ever remember being forced to have a relative or a close friend of the family's give you a hug, or you're supposed to be able to shake your hand, or you're supposed to be able to kiss Aunt Marge, who is very frightening with all of her perfume, or Uncle Charlie, who has his cigarette breath? Well, you just don't know about what to do. You just know that it doesn't feel okay. Cognitively, you cannot understand that, but you just know that it doesn't feel okay. Another thing may be that you're forced to sit on Santa Claus's lap, your parents thinking they're doing a really fun thing for you, but it doesn't feel all right. Again, you don't know how to say it, articulate it, but you know what it feels like, and it doesn't feel okay. So what happens if you protest? I don't want to do this, or you cry, or you respond to what is actually a violation of your awareness of spatial proximity or your boundaries. Often we were shamed or punished. So as children, being so adaptive, we actually said, well, wait a minute, I have to have love and nurturing for me to survive, so we know what works and what doesn't work. And if we are not getting love and attention and nurturing through acknowledging this feeling that we have, then we just learn to shut down the feeling, not trust the feeling, and in the most severe cases, associate our feelings with some kind of trauma or abuse. So that just is kind of what happens, and why we end up here as adults listening to this introduction to the energy work, wondering what happened. Why are we having to learn this all over again if we actually have that part of our brain still intact? That's why I call this work remembering ourselves, so that we remember what all parts of us were. We remember those aspects of ourselves that we've forgotten or have been conditioned out of us, or we've conditioned ourselves not to respond to and with. And so it's important for us to know that it's still in there, although it's unconscious. I also say that this work with horses makes conscious that for us which is unconscious. And so as a result of them responding to our electromagnetic fields or our boundaries, our unconscious boundaries, their behavior can let us know where those boundaries or electromagnetic fields are, because we've forgotten them, or we're not aware of them, or they're so far in our unconscious that we don't even know they're there. So this is part of the equine guided learning, and it is a critical part of self-discovery. So that's one of the most important things about the energy work. So that's number 2. Number 3, that's where we're going to call in Robert and Shannon. And this is the time when before you do the demo, you can ask people for questions. This could be a discussion. It doesn't have to be somebody sitting here lecturing like I've been doing. You can do it more lightly, but if you do it in this order, it's easier for people to understand. So I'm going to take a quick break, and then we'll get started again where Shannon and Robert can do the demo of humans.